Did you hear? Somebody thinks the FMC isn't being good environmental stewards. That's right, a petition was filed for the FMC to do a full environmental impact statement for their detention demurrage rulemaking. And the FMC unanimously, all 5 of them, denied the petition. So what does that mean? I'll break it down. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. All right, story number 1, we're still on watch for language. We are watching for language for the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space. So we talked about it last week. We're going to keep talking about it until we see this language. So the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, OSRA 22, was passed on June 16th over the summer 2022 and had a very long list of to-dos for the FMC. 3 of those to-dos were rulemakings. So the first rulemaking, this unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations, needed to be finished up within 6 months. So that means December 16th it was supposed to be done. And then the other 2 rulemakings, as we all know, detention demurrage, prohibited practices, billing, invoicing, which is open or closed December 13th and is under review for the comments filed. There were almost 200 comments filed. We've been going through all those comments. And the third rulemaking that we're still waiting on is the unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods. I'm really excited for that language. It hasn't come out yet. But the language that we're waiting for, the final text, the final rule, is the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space. Remember, in this rule, it needed to be finished up by December 16th, so we're still waiting. So we're almost a month past their kind of congressionally mandated due date. But what we were expecting from this language was this dealt with the categorical exclusions. The FMC said if there were categorical exclusions of exports was the example given most often, there would be categorical assumptions of unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate. Basically what was happening was during the height of the inbound cargo that was getting $20,000, people were quickly turning around and trying to go back to Asia to go grab more money on that route. And so they weren't necessarily waiting around for the lower dollar exports. It wasn't necessarily only exports. This is going to be neutral to kind of movement, import, or export. But that's what this language was talking about, was the categorical exclusion. And so I'm interested to see, because there were some questions about, if it was part of your business strategy. Some of the comments talked about, well, did the business strategy mean that you had to file a report on what your business strategy is? Does this mean that you kind of have this get out of jail free? I mean, I shouldn't say get out of jail free. I should say this kind of out for the carriers, saying, oh no, well, you know what? It's just part of our business strategy to not take this type of cargo. I'm interested to see, because there was a lot of that business strategy discussion. I think that it's going to ultimately, the nuances are going to come out in case law. But I like that it's making the pause to say, look, you can't just outright deny. You have to reasonably deal with companies for vessel space, and you can't unreasonably refuse to deal. The third one, like I said, so we have D&D still ongoing. The third one, this unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods. Chairman Dan Maffei has been so great in the comments that he's been putting out about kind of just different things that the FMC is doing. And so the VOCC, the Vessel Operating Common Carriers, the carriers, there's a VOCC audit team at the FMC. So they're reviewing some of the largest carriers, most of the carriers actually, and just checking out their practices. You know, this was kind of Congress wanted them to check it out during COVID. The FMC was kind of like, look, we should probably check into some of this. We're getting a lot of complaints. And so the FMC chairman, Dan Maffei, said the Ocean Shipping Reform Act made it clear that it is absolutely illegal for ocean carriers to discriminate or retaliate against a shipper for filing a complaint or challenging a charge. The FMC will thoroughly investigate any allegation of illegal behavior and prosecute aggressively when warranted. This is something that everyone in a company, from the newest sales associate to the CEO, must understand, and that is why the VOCC audit team is carrying this message directly to ocean carriers serving the United States. Even a simple verbal threat to a shipper from an ocean carrier employee could undermine U.S. law and will not be tolerated. That language was all about the VOCC audit team, but I see it as a little glimpse of what's to come with this unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods. I think that this is going to be that catch-all for the shippers who feel as though rates all of a sudden are starting to change, their relationship is starting to change because they spoke up against the carriers they were working with. It's a tough situation. There's only so many carriers out there. There's oodles and oodles of shippers, but so I think that this is going to be important to kind of help balance that, the weight of the kind of magnitude of each of the relationships here, right? So it's absolutely illegal for the discrimination or retaliation against a shipper for challenging a complaint or challenging a charge, or filing a complaint or challenging a charge. That's what FMC Chairman Dan Maffei is saying. I think we'll see strong language in the final rule. I shouldn't say final rule. We'll see it in the presentation of the rule. That might be the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. That might be the notice of proposed rulemaking. It'll be interesting to see, are they kind of questioning, how would you like us to form this rule? Or do they have some language? It kind of sounds like they're ready. They might have some language that they'd like to implement. So be on the lookout for that. I'll make sure to let you know when we see that language. I'm excited for that one. I think that one's going to be, exciting, right? All right, so story number 2. We covered the Federal Trade Commission last week. We talked about who they were, what the Commission of FTC, Federal Trade Commission, means, how it's similar to the Federal Maritime Commission. Go check that out on By Land and by Sea podcast from last week. But what happened was the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, released a notice of proposed rulemaking last week, and now it's open for comments. It was maybe 2 days past when we were talking about it that it was open for comments. They had just posted the language. It takes a couple days for it to get in the Federal Register. Now it's in regulations.gov. If you're against non-competes, think about filing comments. If you're for non-competes, think about filing comments. This is for everybody. There's a lot of comments already filed. You have 60 days to get your comments in. I'm going to link the rulemaking in the notes here so that you can follow it. But this is really exciting. This is subject matter neutral. So it's not just our industry, but this has been a hot topic in the freight and supply chain industry. So go check it out. There's a lot on healthcare. So I follow Matthew Leffler. He's been following this very closely. And he was just posting the other day that there's some healthcare implications. Some doctors and nurses have to uproot their whole families and move outside of wherever they were. And remember, doctors and nurses have licensing requirements that are, for the most part, state specific. So you have to kind of move everything and then go re-license unless they have reciprocity. So I don't know. I'm pretty excited. I hope that these non-competes go away. I think we're probably going to go through the rulemaking process and then we'll probably get some lawsuits against it. Might go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Hold tight. It's not going anywhere quickly, but this is a great first step. So story number 3. This week, Chris Aversano of the Last Dinosaur podcast. So I don't know if you've been following that, but that's a pretty interesting podcast. So what is the Last Dinosaur podcast? He talks about the maritime industry in the digital age. I mean, two kind of competing things, right? A maritime industry in the digital age. That's his whole point. He says that our industry has been the slowest to embrace the digital revolution, thus making it the last dinosaur. Get the name of the podcast now? The Last Dinosaur. But change is happening, and this podcast explores that shift, he says. He talks to innovators, entrepreneurs, investors, and thought leaders that are moving the maritime industry forward in a digital sense. So, he does a great job with his podcast, but a few weeks ago, somebody had asked him, he mentioned on a post on LinkedIn, what other podcasts are out there that focus on maritime? And he said right off the bat, he was able to kind of name a few. The Shipping Podcast by Lena Gothberg. He said Spire Maritime. There were some, unfortunately, By Land and by Sea on his post. Didn't show up as his top 3 right off the top of his mind. But he is a fan of By Land and by Sea. I know that. And he put us, I'm so flattered. He put us on his maritime podcast landscape pictorial graph. I'm going to link to his post here because it really is so interesting. But he pulled together maritime news and personalities, environmental maritime related, finance and startup maritime related, maritime history, and then we sit squarely in the supply chain side. There's a lot of podcasts out there. I don't know if you listen to this, you're probably a podcast person. Maybe you're not. Maybe you just kind of accidentally bumped into this one. There's some other ones out there that I really suggest that you take a listen to. Even if you kind of pop in and pop out, there's some, you can search by title to kind of see if it's subject matter that you might be interested in. There's some really great stuff out there, but this infographic that he put together that shows kind of these different maritime podcasts out there, it's so interesting. I mean, these are worldwide podcasts too. This isn't necessarily, it's probably American focused, but it's international really. I mean, that's the scope of a podcast, right? Quite a few, almost a third, maybe a quarter of my listeners are outside of the United States, which is so cool to see, right? All right, so let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day. What's going on? Okay, so there was a recent petition filed at the FMC for a NEPA review of the detention demurrage rule. Okay, so let me break all this down. So there's some acronyms here. So we're obviously talking about the detention demurrage rulemaking process and the rulemaking that the FMC has. And we've talked about that a lot, right? We've been covering a few of the comments that have been filed. We're going to continue to cover those comments as filed. I'm going to continue to post them on my LinkedIn as I come across interesting ones. We've had Department of Justice, we've had USDA, we've had quite a few people commenting. So as part of any rulemaking process, not just detention demurrage, any rulemaking that's taken up by a federal agency, they have to go through certain things and certain kind of practices and what's needs to be considered. Some of these might include a small business impact statement, a paperwork reduction act. They're kind of all trying to make sure that you're not overburdening small business. You're not overburdening people with paperwork, which is so funny, right? The government. But that's the whole point, right? They want a paperwork reduction act. So you have to go through, is this going to be overly burdensome to these different things? And then there's also a National Environmental Policy Act review. That's the NEPA Act. You've probably heard of NEPA Act with offshore wind quite a bit, and certainly with any maybe infrastructure projects. Environmental Policy Act. It's really where the environmental elements come in. So most of the time, these reviews, these small business impact, the paperwork, even NEPA, are pretty surface level reviews. You kind of review the overall intention of what's happening with the rulemaking, and you kind of say, well, does this have anything to do with that? If it doesn't, you do a little bit of a look into it, and if it really doesn't, then you say, nope, no significant impact. Here's what we looked at, and you kind of move forward. So, look, what does detention demurrage have to do with environmental impact? Projects that have a clear, concrete, hands-on, tangible, actual materials, that's going to have an environmental impact, right? That's going to be something that's out there in the world. Detention demurrage doesn't really have that, right? And even further, this detention demurrage rule is about billing practices and invoices. Okay, so, maybe detention demurrage, if the if the box is sitting on the yard for too long, could have an environmental impact. But I mean, that's kind of a stretch compared to like regulating offshore wind and the turbines, because those have potential for bird strike, right? Have potential for fish habitat disruption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not really the same thing, right? Like that you can kind of think, okay, tangibly, this will have some sort of environmental impact. We need to determine, is it significant? Is it excessive? Is it something that we should be mediating or remediating or trying to limit our touch of this environmental impact? Or does the benefit outweigh the impact? So that's all kind of like what you need to do for environmental review. Detention demurrage and specifically invoicing, I mean the paper that is printed on, but that's not significant. That's anything that's out there. Further, that's part of the Paperwork Reduction Act, right? I mean, even the cargo, even if you think about the cargo sitting on the yard, it's not necessarily an environmental impact. Like it's not going to like squish a squirrel or there's just nothing. I mean, maybe the vessel, but then that's the vessel. That's not the cargo box, right? That's kind of disjointed. The scope of demurrage or detention is, okay, arguably on a chassis or in a warehouse, or it doesn't necessarily automatically mean that it's moving if it's detention. It just means you have the box. Demurrage, right, is it sitting on the yard for too long. I mean, it's not moving in kind of its thought. That's the whole point. Demurrage isn't moving. Demurrage is supposed to incentivize movement. It's just not the same thing, right? So what happened procedurally? So that's kind of my initial layout of what's happening. But what happened procedurally? What were the steps and when? So October 14, 2022, that's when the Commission issued their notice of proposed rulemaking, seeking public comment on a proposed rule on this detention demurrage rule. They were asking about specific minimum information on demurrage and detention invoices. The proposal outlined certain billing practices relevant to appropriate timeframes for issuing invoices, disputing charges with the billing party, and resolving such disputes. They also require common carriers to include a list of minimum information on the invoices that was also presented by Congress, and how to establish billing practices that billing parties must follow when invoicing for demurrage and detention charges. So the Commission says, during the rulemaking process, the Commission conducted an environmental assessment, EA, and found that there was no significant environmental impact. So then on November 29th, just over maybe 6 weeks later, the Commission published a notice of availability in the Federal Register at the finding of no significant impact statement. So it's a FONSI is what it's called. That's the acronym, FONSI, because everybody loves acronyms. So finding of no significant impact. The Commission stated that the FONSI would become final within 10 days of publication of the notice unless a petition for review was filed using the federal portal, the regulations.gov, which is kind of where the FMC is moving all of their docketed matters. So let's go back. So what did the FMC say in that rulemaking in October? They obviously had to address National Environmental Policy Act, just like they had to address, the Paperwork Reduction Act. So what does that section say of the rulemaking? You probably never even noticed it. It's at the very end of the rulemaking. You can go back and check it too, but it's the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. So the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 requires federal agencies to consider the environmental impacts of proposed major federal action significantly affecting the quality of the human environment, as well as impacts of alternatives to the proposed action. So they're just kind of setting up, what is it? And they say, so when a federal agency prepares an environmental assessment, the Council on Environmental Quality implementing NEPA implementing regulations require the federal agency to include brief discussions of the need for the proposal of alternatives of the environmental impacts of the proposed action and alternatives and a listing of agencies and persons consulted. Okay. So they're basically saying this section serves as the Commission's draft environmental assessment for the proposed changes. So upon completion of an environmental assessment, it was determined that the proposed rule will not constitute a major federal action significantly affecting the quality of the human environment within the meaning of NEPA. That's what the FMC said. They said, look, we did the environmental assessment. We determined that the proposed rule does not have a major significant environmental impact. This finding of no significant impact, FONSI, will become final within 10 days of publication of this notice in the Federal Register unless petition is filed. So that's what it said. So saying, look, we looked at it, we checked it out. There's not a lot of information there, but okay. Like I said, it's a detention demurrage billing. What does it have to do with environment in a concrete, tangible, like I said, I mean, are you squishing a squirrel? I mean, like, there's just not a ton. And I'm sure you could make an argument that there is something, but it's not as direct as what NEPA really is trying to get at here. It's not supposed to be overly burdensome on progress. It's supposed to be actually helping the environment in an environmental stewardship and requiring that any rule takes the environment into consideration if it does impact it. So they filed this finding of no significant impact, saying that the environmental assessment found no significant environmental impact. Look, this is very important to the overall regulatory process, but it just doesn't apply to this rulemaking. So there was a petition filed within that 10 days by the World Shipping Council and the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association. They also filed comments for the detention to merge rule generally as well, which actually, they didn't discuss the environmental assessment though, but if I remember right, curiously, I think that they did talk about environment quite a bit, and I remember thinking, why are they hitting environment so much on detention to merge? Now it's starting to all make sense, right? So on December 9th, 2022, the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, PMSA, and the World Shipping Council filed a petition for the Commission to review the environmental assessment and this finding of no significant impact. They were challenging the adequacy of the Commission's environmental assessment and alleging that the Commission is obligated to prepare a full environmental impact statements. These EIS reports, you may have heard of them, are very technical and very scientific. Usually engineers and scientists are involved. They can take years. And like I said, this doesn't really have an environmental impact, right? I mean, this is invoicing, this is billing, this is kind of the business side of things, and it doesn't really have that tangible environmental. Okay, so the FMC responded, and look, all 5 of them in unison, how often do we get all 5 of them, denied the petition. So the petitioners, the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association and the World Shipping Council basically said, I think you should pause this whole process and do a full environmental review to make sure that we are the best environmental stewards we can be. And the FMC said, I see through this. There isn't a significant environmental impact here, let alone arguably any environmental impact, significant or otherwise. So what did the denial of the petition say? It said, because the focus of this proposal is on invoicing practices, the Commission determined that the proposal would not affect port operations, and there would be no significant impact on energy, air quality, noise pollution, hazardous cargoes, water quality, biological, recreational, cultural, and archaeological or land use. They said, look, it's not going to affect any of that stuff. No significant impact on any of that stuff. In further considering the alternatives of 1, modifying the notice of proposed rulemaking, or 2, terminating the notice of proposed rulemaking, which I think is maybe what the petition was getting at, the environmental assessment also found that there would not be significant environmental impacts because even if the NPRM, the notice of proposed rulemaking, were modified, this is FMC text, a rule on invoicing would not affect port operations, and terminating the proposed rule would have no impact. They're saying, look, even if we got rid of this rule, there's no gain environmentally because there is no impact environmentally. I agree, right? I mean, to me, this makes sense. You kind of follow the logic, and this makes sense. So Chairman Dan Maffei, who has not been afraid to speak his mind, and I love it, said in publicly released comments on the petition denial, these comments, I mean, he's just been coming with the hits on all of his comments. So he says, quoted from his comments on his website, I feel I must call it out when I see an attempt to subvert the regulatory process by filing a petition. So he's saying, look, I smell funny business here. So he continues. The PMSA and the World Shipping Council, WSC, petition claims to be promoting the public good, but actually seeks to misapply the National Environmental Policy Act to thwart the FMC's efforts to implement the will of Congress and the President of the United States. They're saying these petitioners are trying to thwart what Congress told FMC to do. Okay, continuing on. It opens a path to derail an FMC rulemaking that meets a requirement established in the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. The law specifically emphasized the importance of billing the appropriate parties to transactions, and the FMC is currently considering a proposed rule concerned with improving the fairness of detention to merge billing. He continues on. The filing of this petition, even after its rejection today, could lay the groundwork for the carriers to obstruct the proposed rule in federal court by arguing for a full NEPA environmental impact assessment, a process that often takes multiple years before the rule can go into effect. It would certainly not be the first time that an industry utilized legal proceedings to find administrative avenues to undermine needed regulatory changes. He's basically saying, not the first time somebody's trying to throw some procedure, some legal procedure at the process because they want to stop the rule. It has nothing to do, he's saying basically that it has nothing to do with the environment actually. He's saying they're trying to stop this rule. So he continues, to imply, as the petition does, that challenging the Commission's environmental assessment is, quote, and he's quoting from the petition, the best way to address impacts on the quality of the human environment in lower income and minority communities surrounding seaport areas, Commission Chairman Maffei says, it fails the eye roll test. Right? These comments. So he continues on. This is the last little part. I see such dilatory tactics as wholly inconsistent with the individual statements of cooperation with the FMC's broad effort to implement ASRA that I have received from many members of the World Shipping Council Board. Okay, there you have it. On its face, it may seem like the World Shipping Council and the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association were well-intentioned, right? I mean, maybe on its face. There's a push for global environmental stewardship and shipping generally, so that's why they were trying to promote making sure there's thorough consideration for environmental stewardship. But look, I keep saying it, arguably D&D invoicing affects the carriers in an administrative burden way the most. And that's kind of the purpose of it, right? That's why Congress directed the FMC to do so many things to clean up the industry. I mean, I kind of respect the legal strategy here, right? It's part of a kind of a kitchen sink strategy. But this one didn't work. And they maybe knew it wouldn't work. And they may still appeal this. They may still appeal the Commission's denial of the petition. And it might get caught up in some more court procedural pauses, which, really would be bad for the industry. Like this detention to merge rulemaking, we went from Wild Wild West, you could have a bar napkin with a number on it that said this is your demurrage invoice, to like now you have 13 required things, and now the FMC is proposing 30-day requirements to issue invoices, otherwise they're defined. There's some really good cleanup that's happening here. And it's kind of at risk of maybe being delayed for years. I mean, the FMC denied the petition, so it's not at risk there. But if this gets appealed, it potentially could. But look, maybe Congress could intercede at some point. This was all driven by Congress, really. I mean, the FMC before that, right? Remember, the FMC was already working on detention merge rulemakings before Congress was like, you know what you should do? You should work on a detention and demerge rulemaking. The FMC was like, great idea, because they already were. But anyway, so it was supported and socially vocalized in a large-scale way by Congress when they passed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. So look, this may not be the hill to die on. I don't see this as a major problem, but it could be a pain to the overall process. So we'll see. I'm going to continue to kind of watch this. All this to know, I think the FMC kind of read this correctly. We all want to be good environmental stewards, and I think that the shipping environment does need to clean things up, but we also need to clean up our books right now. We need to clean up our processes. We need to clean up our industry because there were some major losses and gains, and the industry needs to kind of rebalance itself. Our pendulum's swinging pretty wildly right now. We all just went through some weird things. So, let's kind of clean this up. So I'm going to keep watching this. I don't expect too much from this, but let's watch. Look, as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal, the e-learning, the general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know, comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast by Land and by Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page by Land and by Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out the website, themaritimeprofessor.com. E-courses, still building them. They're coming soon. So until next week, this is Lauren Began, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea.